The year is 1943. A German officer presses a pistol against the back of a woman's skull. She is wearing an American military uniform. She is 24 years old. She does not scream. He pulls the trigger. The gun clicks. Empty. He laughs. His soldiers laugh. And Lieutenant Mary Collins understands in that single frozen second that death would have been the mercy. Don't forget to hit like, subscribe, and turn on notifications so you never miss our next video. Join us as we uncover more stories, historical events, and inspiring moments from the past. This community is built for people who believe forgotten history deserves to be heard. What you are about to hear was locked inside classified vaults for over 50 years. The United States government sealed these files higher than atomic research. Britain buried the testimony of its own soldiers. France pretended these women never existed. Because what the Germans did to captured female military personnel was not a series of isolated incidents carried out by rogue soldiers. It was a system, documented, approved at the highest levels, refined through experimentation, and deliberately hidden from the world the moment the war ended. Hundreds of women, American, British, French, caught behind enemy lines, separated from male prisoners, and processed through facilities that appeared on no official map, received no Red Cross visits, and followed procedures written in Berlin by SS officers who had been planning this since 1942. By the time Allied forces liberated the last of these secret sites in April 1945, some women had turned white-haired at 26. Others could not speak. A few could not be touched without screaming. And within weeks of their liberation, their own government sat them down, placed papers in front of them, and told them to sign away their right to ever speak the truth. This is the story of what really happened. And it begins not with a general or a politician, but with a young woman from Ohio named Mary Collins, who wanted nothing more than to serve her country, and who walked into a nightmare that her country would spend half a century pretending she never had. The year is 1941. America has just entered the war. Recruitment offices across the country are overwhelmed. The military machine is running at a scale never before seen in human history, and it needs bodies. Trained bodies. Thousands of them. Women's Army Corps recruitment officers fan out across American cities with a simple message: your country needs you, and there is meaningful work to be done. Mary Collins is 22 years old, working as a telephone switchboard operator in Columbus, Ohio. She is precise, fast, and calm under pressure. Those are exactly the skills the WAC is looking for. She signs her papers in October 1941 and ships out for training 6 weeks later. She is good at everything they teach her. Radio communications, signal routing coordination under fire. Her supervisors note in her file that she maintains composure in high-stress situations at a level unusual even for male recruits. By 1943, she is a lieutenant stationed in Italy, managing radio communications for Allied forces pushing up toward Monte Cassino. She is miles behind the front lines. She is not supposed to be in danger. The rules of war are supposed to protect her. She believes this completely. She is not alone in that belief. Across the Atlantic, British Air Transport Auxiliary pilot Sarah Bennett is ferrying Spitfires from factories to airfields across England and later into France. She is 27, the daughter of a schoolteacher from Bath, and she has been flying since she was 16. The ATA takes her because she is one of the best pilots available, full stop. Not the best female pilot, the best pilot. She delivers hundreds of aircraft through dangerous skies and goes home each night believing that her uniform, her identification papers, and the Geneva Convention stand between her and the worst that war can do. In the French countryside, a woman named Elise moves through the dark with a detonator in her coat pocket. She has no rank because the resistance gives no ranks. She has no uniform because uniforms get you shot in the street. She is a farmer's daughter from Lyon who started carrying messages between cells in 1940 and graduated to blowing up supply lines by 1942. She has destroyed 6 railway bridges and does not consider herself a soldier exactly. But she fights. These 3 women have never met. They do not know each other's names, but in the summer and autumn of 1943, their paths will converge inside a system that someone in Berlin has been very carefully building. Most people who learn about World War II learn about the laws of war as if they functioned. The Geneva Convention, the Red Cross, prisoner exchanges, the expectation that a soldier captured in uniform would be processed, numbered, and eventually returned. This framework was imperfect and violated constantly, but it existed, and for male prisoners in Western Europe, it provided at least partial protection. For female military personnel, it provided essentially nothing. This was not accidental. In June 1943, German High Command issued a classified memo that would not surface until after the war ended. The language was bureaucratic and cold. Female enemy combatants represent a unique category of prisoner. They are not to be processed through standard POW channels. Their status as women who have voluntarily abandoned normal feminine roles makes them subject to specialized protocols. That phrase, specialized protocols, is doing enormous work in that sentence. What it meant in practice was this: when a woman in Allied military service fell into German hands, she disappeared. She did not go to a Stalag. She did not receive a prisoner number that the Red Cross could track. She did not enter the system that governed the treatment of male prisoners. She went somewhere else entirely. Schau. The Germans had by late 1943 created at least 15 specialized detention facilities across occupied Europe. None appeared on official prison records. None received Red Cross inspections. None permitted prisoner exchanges. They were designed from the ground up to hold women the German military viewed not as enemy soldiers, but as something requiring a different category of response. The planning for this system had begun in 1942, which means that by the time Mary Collins and Sarah Bennett were captured, the Germans had been preparing for them for over a year. A meeting at SS headquarters that year, attended by officers from intelligence medicine and psychology, produced a document called Protocol 27. Its minutes were discovered decades after the war. The language is clinical enough to be almost unreadable. But what it describes is a deliberate scientific program for breaking women who had chosen military roles. SS Colonel Werner Haas wrote in those minutes that the female enemy soldier presents both a challenge and an opportunity. Their capture allows us to study this Western perversion while simultaneously developing methods to break their unusually strong resistance. That word resistance is significant. The Germans expected these women to be easy. They were wrong, and the fact that they were wrong made everything worse. In late October 1943, German tanks broke through Allied lines near Monte Cassino in a surprise push that overran several rear area positions. Mary Collins was at her radio when the attack began. She had seconds. Not enough seconds. German soldiers surrounded the small headquarters building and took 5 WAC officers prisoner before any of them could reach safety. The German captain who received them spoke perfect English. He looked at Mary's Lieutenant Bars with an expression she would describe years later as something between amusement and appetite. She told him clearly, "We are military personnel protected under the Geneva Convention." He smiled at her. It was not a reassuring smile. She and the 4 other women were loaded into a truck separate from male prisoners taken in the same action. Through the truck's small rear window, she could see the male prisoners being processed in an open field, cataloged and numbered in the standard way. Her truck drove in a different direction. One of the guards said something to another in German. Mary had been picking up the language during her time in Italy. The words were simple. These ones go to the special facility. The way he smiled when he said it. Passe, the facility where they arrived before dawn, had no markings, no flags, no signs. It had been a small hospital before the war. Now it served a purpose its original architects could not have imagined. The gates closed behind the truck, and Mary understood with the particular clarity that comes only in moments of genuine danger that whatever rules she had believed in were not present in this place. The first thing they took was not weapons or identification. The first thing they took systematically and deliberately was dignity. A German woman in a crisp uniform, not a nurse, not a doctor, but something else. Something with authority over this specific process directed what came next. The 5 American women were ordered to remove everything. They were standing in a concrete room with bright lights and a cold floor and 5 guards watching. Mary said what she had been trained to say. She cited the convention. The German woman cut her off. That agreement is for soldiers. You are women who have forgotten your place. So, what followed was recorded in German documents as Female Prisoner Processing Protocol. German officers walked around the women making notes. A camera flashed repeatedly, and the photographs taken that night were later found not in identification files, but in the personal collections of camp commanders. They were not records. They were trophies.
Danke.
Sarah Bennett arrived at a different facility near Paris on the same day her Spitfire shot down by anti-aircraft guns herself captured, hiding in a farmer's barn just before sunset. She had her papers. She had her uniform. None of it mattered. The officer in charge told her she would not be going to a regular prisoner camp. Her unusual situation, he said, required special handling. She kept a diary throughout her captivity, hidden in a crack in the wall of her cell. In it, she wrote what the male officers writing official reports could not bring themselves to transcribe. The most shocking part, she wrote, was how organized it was. This wasn't random cruelty. They had a system, a process forms to fill out special rooms set up just for women prisoners. They had been planning this. The examinations at these facilities lasted hours. German doctors, mostly men, performed unnecessary physical procedures while German intelligence officers asked invasive questions about personal lives, military assignments, and unit locations. All of it was recorded in clinical language in files marked Female Prisoner Processing Protocol. A document found after the war explained the purpose in terms that strip away any remaining ambiguity. Western women who take military roles maintain psychological strength through identification with male soldiers. This identification must be systematically dismantled. They understood something about identity. They understood that a soldier's resistance comes partly from knowing who she is. So the first objective was to make these women stop knowing. Take the uniform. Take the privacy. Replace the uniform with civilian clothing, often too small, always without undergarments, never with proper shoes. When Mary demanded proper POW treatment, she was told by a guard who seemed genuinely amused that soldiers endure hardship without complaint. Consider this your first test. That night, the temperature dropped to near freezing. The women had no blankets. They pressed together for warmth. Strangers becoming something closer than friends through the particular intimacy of shared suffering. But the Germans had miscalculated. They had expected Western women to break quickly under these conditions. What they got instead was something they were not prepared for. The women organized. In whispers in the dark, in the hours when guards were not immediately present, the women began to build a structure among themselves. They recited their ranks and serial numbers to each other every night. They created codes for communicating when guards were watching. They shared the small amounts of water they were given with whoever needed it most. When one of them was taken away for questioning and came back unable to walk, the others cleaned her up, held her, whispered to her until she could speak again. Sarah wrote about an American WAC sergeant who was taken every night for 2 weeks. When they brought her back, she couldn't walk, but she never told them anything, not one word beyond her name and number. When they finally gave up on her, she whispered the Pledge of Allegiance to the others in her room. Still a soldier, still fighting. They could take everything visible. They could not take that. The Germans noticed this solidarity and tried to dismantle it the only way they knew how. They offered better treatment to women who informed on others. Extra food. Warmer clothes. Easier conditions. It almost never worked. The bonds these women formed were not the bonds of convenience. They were the bonds of people who had decided in the most absolute terms that they would not let what was being done to them become who they were. German files from this period rate individual prisoners on something called adjustment to female status. The women they were struggling to break were rated poorly on this scale. Some files note with visible frustration that subjects maintain military identity despite sustained processing. In the bureaucratic language of the Third Reich, that is as close as you will get to an admission of failure. But the files also note what came next: enhanced protocols, escalation, transfer to facilities designated for difficult cases. In late November 1943, Mary Collins and the surviving members of her original group were loaded onto covered trucks again. Night travel, blacked-out windows, deeper into German-controlled territory. When the trucks stopped, they were at a facility near Frankfurt that did not appear on any official German prison record. It was designated for women with military intelligence training. Women, the Germans had decided, required a different approach. SERE Bennett was transferred to a similar site. Elise, without a uniform or formal military status, had been classified from the beginning as a female terrorist and processed with additional public components that Mary and SERE had been spared. Yet what waited at these deeper facilities was what the Germans called enhanced female interrogation protocols. The documents that describe these protocols in clinical detail were found after the war. Allied authorities immediately classified them at a level higher than most nuclear research. They were considered too disturbing for public knowledge. The women who survived these facilities came home to a world that was not ready to hear what they had to say. A world that would, in fact, spend decades making sure they never said it. But that is the story of what came after. And what came after is almost as dark as what came before. In Part 2, we go inside the enhanced facilities. We follow Mary Collins through the interrogation process that German documents describe in precise, horrifying detail. We uncover the names of the senior SS officers who personally approved these methods and requested progress reports. And we reveal the moment in December 1944 when Heinrich Himmler himself convened a meeting in Berlin to evaluate the program's results. What those results showed about which women broke and which ones never did will challenge everything you think you know about strength, resistance, and what human beings are capable of surviving. In Part 1, we followed Lieutenant Mary Collins' British pilot SERE Bennett and French resistance fighter Elise into the shadow system the Germans had built specifically for captured female military personnel. 15 unmarked facilities. No Red Cross. No prisoner numbers. No record of their existence. Mary arrived at a site near Frankfurt classified for difficult cases. SERE disappeared into a facility outside Paris. And the Germans, frustrated that these women refused to break during initial processing, escalated. The cliffhanger we left on was this: Heinrich Himmler personally convened a meeting in December 1944 to evaluate the female prisoner program. What his officers reported that day would shock even the men who had designed the system. But before we get to Berlin, we need to understand what happened in the months between capture and that meeting. Because what the Germans attempted during those months and what these women did in response is the real story. And it starts with a man named Colonel Dieter Rahn who believed he could break any prisoner in 72 hours. SERE. Rahn had spent the first years of the war in Poland and the Eastern Front running interrogation facilities for the SS. He had credentials. He had results. He had a reputation inside the German intelligence apparatus as someone who understood the psychology of resistance and how to dismantle it. When he was transferred to the Frankfurt facility in October 1943, his superiors gave him a specific mandate. The current methods are producing insufficient intelligence yield from female military prisoners. Fix it. He read through the existing files on Mary Collins and the other American women. He read the processing reports. He noted the ratings given to each prisoner under adjustment to female status, and he observed that every single one of them was rated as resistant. He called his staff together the morning after his arrival. "These women are not broken because you are thinking about them incorrectly," he told them. "You are treating them like male prisoners who happen to be female. They are not that. Their resistance comes from a different place. We must attack that place specifically." What he meant, and what the documents found after the war make explicit, was this: male prisoners maintained resistance partly through military identity, partly through physical endurance, and partly through loyalty to their units. Female military prisoners, Rahn believed, maintained resistance primarily through their bonds with each other. The solidarity that German guards had been observing and failing to disrupt was not a side effect of captivity. It was the primary mechanism keeping these women functional, and his solution was systematic isolation combined with what he called comparative pressure. Take women out of the group, subject them to interrogation individually, then use what happened to one woman as leverage against another. Create situations where a prisoner must choose between her own suffering and someone else's. Why? The documents recording his methods were classified by Allied authorities in 1945 and remained sealed until 2001. What they describe in clinical language is a program of psychological and physical abuse designed with the precision of a scientific study. Sessions were timed, responses were measured, results were categorized by prisoner nationality, military branch age, and prior trauma history. This was not cruelty for its own sake. This was research, and that distinction made it worse. Mary Collins testified about this period in a report sealed for 56 years. "They didn't take me to the regular interrogation room," she said. The transcript notes that she stopped speaking for several minutes. What she eventually described to the investigators was recorded stamped top secret and placed in a file that a researcher would not open until 2001. Bennett. But the testimony that survives, partial and heavily redacted, tells enough. The night interrogations, the officers' quarters rather than formal rooms, the use of junior women prisoners as leverage against senior ones. Elise described it with the most clarity of anyone whose words survived. They would bring in the youngest girl, just 19. They would tell me either I answered their questions or they watched what happened to her. What choice did I have? But the next day, there would be new questions, new threats. It never ended. Rahn filed his first progress report to SS headquarters in November 1943. It was largely positive. He had obtained some intelligence, confirmed some unit locations, extracted some information about Allied signal protocols. But buried in the technical language was an admission that troubled his superiors. Subject cohesion remains higher than anticipated despite separation protocols. Individual resistance collapses under direct pressure but reconstitutes rapidly upon reintegration with group. Recommend extended isolation periods before further sessions. In Berlin, that phrase "reconstitutes rapidly" was underlined. Someone wrote in the margin in German, "How is this possible?" It was possible because of what was happening in the cells and corridors of the Frankfurt facility during the hours when guards were not conducting formal sessions. The women had adapted. The ones returned from interrogation were received by the others with a system of care that was entirely improvised and entirely effective. Water shared from a communal ration. Bodies used as warmth. Whispered words repeated until the words reached the person who needed them most. SERE wrote in her hidden diary about a night in December 1943 when 3 women came back to the cell block in the same hour. All 3 had been taken separately. All 3 were in serious condition. The other women organized around them without speaking, without needing to speak, each person moving to where she was needed. By morning, all 3 were sitting upright. 2 could talk. 1 was whispering the names of her squadron members to herself like a prayer. They could take everything visible. They could not take that. Rahn escalated in December. He requested and received authorization for what his documents call enhanced separation, meaning individual cells. No group time, strictly controlled contact between prisoners. This was a significant operational change. It required more staff, more space, and more resources. SS headquarters approved it within 48 hours, which tells you how seriously Berlin was taking the problem of women who refused to break. The enhanced separation lasted 6 weeks. It was the hardest period that any of the surviving women described. Alone in a cell, no voices, no warmth of other bodies, no nightly recitation of ranks and names. The system that had sustained them was gone. For 6 weeks, each woman was entirely alone with what was being done to her, and the question of whether she would survive it. Some didn't survive it whole. German files from this period note 2 deaths that were recorded as medical causes. Allied investigators after the war disputed these classifications. The files on those 2 women, their names, their units, their families, were among the records destroyed in April 1945 as Allied forces approached. But most of the women did survive those 6 weeks. And what happened when Rahn ended the isolation period and attempted to conduct fresh interrogations revealed something he had not expected and could not explain in his files. The intelligence yield did not improve. It dropped. Women who had been isolated for 6 weeks and subjected to sustained pressure came out of that period saying less, not more. Their resistance had not collapsed. It had reorganized internally. Without the external structure of the group to sustain them, they had built something inside themselves that served the same function. They had become individually what they had previously been collectively. Rahn wrote in his February 1944 report, "Subject resilience does not appear to diminish with isolation as predicted. Recommend consultation with Psychology Division regarding revised assessment of Western female military personnel." That consultation happened in March 1944. The Psychology Division told Rahn what the files had been suggesting for months. The women's resistance was not breaking because its source was not what he thought. He had been attacking identity. He had been trying to make them forget they were soldiers, but their resistance was not coming from being soldiers exactly. It was coming from something older than that, something the military training had organized, but not created. The question of what to do about it went unanswered. In December 1944, with Allied forces pushing toward Germany from the west and the east simultaneously, Himmler convened the meeting. His intelligence officers had been preparing for months. Officers from multiple detention facilities attended. Each presented findings on their female prisoner programs. The meeting's minutes were found in 1995 in a former Stasi archive in East Berlin, and they contain a detail that stops you cold when you read it. The facility that reported the most complete failure was the one handling Soviet women pilots, the Night Witches. The female bomber crews the Red Army had been deploying since 1942 proved entirely unbreakable by every method applied. German officers at the meeting stated flatly that no technique developed for Western female prisoners produced any measurable result with Soviet women, and that further resources directed at this population were not recommended. The facility near Frankfurt reported partial success with Americans and British defined in the German documents as intelligence yield sufficient to justify continued operation. But the definition of success had shifted significantly from what SS headquarters had requested in 1943. They had asked for broken prisoners. What they received were prisoners who occasionally provided tactical information under extreme duress, while maintaining core identity and refusing strategic disclosure. The French resistance women fell between these groups depending heavily on individual history and age. What the meeting produced was a directive to shift categorization from national origin to psychological profile. Stop sorting prisoners by where they came from. Start sorting them by who they were. The science of breaking people had collided with the reality of people who would not be broken, and the science had been forced to evolve. Allied forces began finding the secret facilities in April 1945. The liberating soldiers were not prepared for what they discovered. Mary Collins was found in a facility near Munich, weighing 85 pounds, her hair white in patches at 26 years old. She stood up when American soldiers entered the room and said, "We are American WACs. We are soldiers like you." The sergeant who found her group wrote in his report that he cried. Then he helped carry her out. And within days, military intelligence officers arrived to begin the process that would in many ways constitute a second captivity. The women were separated from other freed prisoners. They were taken to different hospitals. No photographers. No reporters. A colonel explained that certain aspects of their experience were classified and should not be discussed with anyone. Ever. Papers were produced. Signatures were requested. The United States government, the British government, the French government. All of them looked at what these women had survived and made the same calculation. This cannot be public. A memo from American military intelligence explains the reasoning in terms that are almost as disturbing as the German documents they are responding to. Detailed accounts could cause public relations issues and impact future recruitment of women. These experiences, while regrettable, do not serve any intelligence purpose and should be sealed. While regrettable, but here is what the governments sealing those files did not account for. Women who had survived Colonel Rahn's enhanced protocols and 6 weeks of isolation and night interrogations were not going to be stopped by paperwork. They went home. They went silent publicly as required. But privately, in letters and hidden journals and conversations that happened in hushed voices decades later, they kept the record. They kept it for the day when someone would be ready to hear it. Mary Collins kept journals hidden in her attic until her death in 1988. Sarah Bennett wrote letters to a former fellow prisoner throughout the 1950s that described carefully and completely what had happened. Elise spoke to a researcher named Professor Helen Richards in 1987 in a recorded interview that sat in an archive for years before anyone understood what it contained. In Part 3, we go into what happened when those records began to surface. The researchers who found the German documents in East Berlin in 1995. The American declassification in 2001 that the government held with no press and no public statement, just a quiet acknowledgement of something hidden for half a century. And the question that runs through all of it: what does it mean that these women were betrayed twice, once by their captors and once by the countries they served? That question has an answer, and the answer is more complicated than either side of it wants to admit. In Parts 1 and 2, we followed Mary Collins, Sarah Bennett, and Elise from capture, through the secret processing facilities, through Colonel Rahn's escalating interrogation programs, through 6 weeks of isolation that failed to break them, and into the December 1944 meeting where Himmler's officers admitted their female prisoner program had not produced what Berlin wanted. The women survived. The system designed to destroy them failed, and when Allied forces found them in April 1945, the governments that liberated them immediately began the work of making sure no one ever found out. That second betrayal is what Part 3 is about. Because what happened after liberation was not a footnote, it was a campaign, organized, resourced, and sustained for 50 years. And it very nearly worked. In the weeks following liberation, American military intelligence moved quickly. The women from the Frankfurt facility were transported to a field hospital near Heidelberg that had been designated specifically for female POWs. This designation sounds like a kindness. It was not. It meant separation from the broader flow of liberated prisoners, which meant no journalists, no photographers, and no witnesses from outside the military apparatus. Male prisoners liberated from German camps were processed through the same facilities, which meant they encountered reporters, Red Cross workers, and eventually family members who came to collect them. Their stories began entering the public record immediately. Within weeks of liberation, American newspapers were running accounts of Stalag conditions of forced labor, of the specific cruelties of German captivity for male soldiers. The women's hospital near Heidelberg had a perimeter. Guards on the perimeter had orders: no press, no outside personnel, no exceptions. Dates. The debriefing process began within 72 hours of arrival. Women who had spent months or years in conditions that no trauma specialist would consider them ready to discuss were placed in rooms with male officers holding clipboards and asked to describe in sequence and in detail everything that had happened to them. The officers conducting these debriefings had no training in handling trauma. Several testimonies from this period include notes by the debriefing officer indicating that he requested a break, or that he left the room briefly, or that he spilled something. The women kept talking. At the end of each debriefing session, 2 documents were presented. The first was a standard military debriefing acknowledgement. The second was different. It specified that the subject agreed not to disclose certain experiences to any person, including doctors, family members, journalists, or government officials, not holding the appropriate clearance level. The justification given was national security. The real justification was in a memo written by American military intelligence that would not surface until 2001. Detailed accounts could cause public relations issues and impact future recruitment of women into military service. Mary Collins signed the second document. Sarah Bennett signed it. Elise, as a French national, was processed through a parallel French intelligence procedure that produced the same outcome by different paperwork. All of them went home carrying secrets their governments had legally required them to keep. What their governments had not accounted for was that these women were trained intelligence personnel who had maintained operational security under conditions that broke most people. Keeping a secret from the public was not a challenge for them. The challenge was living with what they knew and finding no sanctioned outlet for it. Mary went back to Ohio. She worked for 15 years as a telephone operator, the same job she had left to join the WAC. She never married. Her neighbors described her as quiet and self-contained. She had nightmares that she did not discuss. She saw doctors who diagnosed her with nervous conditions and prescribed sedatives. She did not tell the doctors what caused the nightmares because she had signed a document. Sarah returned to Bath and married in 1947. She wrote to a fellow prisoner in 1952 that she could not bear to be touched for years, and that her husband believed this was a physical problem she had never corrected his understanding. She stopped flying. She had been one of the best pilots the ATA ever produced, and she never flew again after 1945. Elise returned to Lyon and worked in her family's bakery. She gave one interview to a local newspaper in 1946 about her time in the resistance, mentioning bridges she had destroyed and messages she had carried. She mentioned nothing else. The interviewer asked no follow-up questions. Yes, these three women and the hundreds like them across 3 countries carried their silences into the 1950s, the 1960s, the 1970s. The official history of women in World War II was written without them. Books about the WAC celebrated their contributions to communications and logistics. Books about the ATA celebrated the women who ferried aircraft across dangerous skies. Books about the French resistance celebrated the courage of those who fought the occupation. None of these books contained the word Frankfurt, or the phrase special facility, or any accounting of what happened to women who were captured. The German documents describing what had been done were in Allied hands from 1945 onward. Some had been used in war crimes trials at Nuremberg, but only partially, and the sections relating specifically to female prisoners had been classified before the trials began. Prosecutors at Nuremberg worked from redacted versions of documents that researchers would not see in full for another 50 years. In the 1970s, a generation of historians began pressing for declassification of wartime records. The Freedom of Information Act in the United States, passed in 1966, created mechanisms for requesting government documents. Researchers filed requests. Documents came back heavily redacted. Sections relating to female POWs were among the most consistently blacked out. One researcher who filed repeated requests across a decade received a response in 1979 informing him that certain materials relating to female military personnel remained classified at a level that precluded disclosure under current guidelines. That phrase, current guidelines, matters. It suggests the classification was being actively maintained, not simply inherited from wartime. Someone in 1979 was still making decisions about keeping these files sealed. The first significant break came not from government archives, but from a private one. In 1985, Professor Helen Richards at the University of Edinburgh began what she described as a recovery project seeking out women who had served in female military auxiliary units during the war and recording their oral histories. She was not specifically looking for prisoners. She was building a general record of women's wartime service. But as she conducted interviews across Britain, France, and the United States, a pattern emerged. Women who had been captured would begin speaking about their service, and then stop at a specific point. They would say something like, "And then I was taken," and then pause for a long time. Several told her directly that there were things they had signed agreements not to discuss. She began asking carefully whether they would be willing to speak on background, not for direct attribution, not for immediate publication. Slowly, some said yes. The picture that emerged from these conversations matched what was in the classified documents with a precision that ruled out coincidence or fabrication. These women, who had not spoken to each other in decades, who had been held in different facilities across different countries, described the same procedures, the same language used by guards, the same structure of processing, followed by escalation, followed by the isolation phase that Rahn had implemented in late 1943. Richards published a preliminary paper in 1987. She was careful. She cited available documents, she quoted only on background, she made no claims she could not support. The paper circulated in academic circles and generated modest interest. 2 British newspapers requested interviews. Her university press office handled the requests. Nothing significant resulted. Then 1995 happened. A team of German archivists working through records recovered from a former Stasi facility in East Berlin found a sealed crate that had been transferred from a Wehrmacht archive before Soviet forces reached it in 1945. Inside the crate were documents that had not been reviewed since they were packed. Training manuals for female prisoner handling. Progress reports from individual facilities. Minutes from the December 1944 Berlin meeting. Colonel Rahn's complete file, including his final assessment that Western female military prisoners were more resistant than any previous projections had estimated, and his recommendation that the program be reassessed at the foundational level. The documents were transferred to the German Federal Archives and made available to researchers in 1996. Richards flew to Berlin within a week of the announcement. What she found confirmed everything the women had told her. The clinical language of Rahn's reports, describing techniques and their outcomes, matched the descriptions these women had given in recorded conversations. The timeline matched. The specific details of the processing procedure, the separation from male prisoners, the classification as morally compromised, the isolation escalation. All of it was there in German bureaucratic prose stamped with official seals, signed by officers whose names appeared in other wartime records. The women had been telling the truth, and the governments that had silenced them had known they were telling the truth when they silenced them. Richards published her full account in 1998. It was reviewed in academic journals, covered briefly in quality newspapers in Britain and Germany, and produced a small amount of parliamentary discussion in Westminster about the treatment of women veterans. No formal inquiry was announced. No government statement was issued. In the United States, the response came 3 years later in 2001, when the Defense Department quietly declassified selected files relating to female POWs from World War II. A small ceremony was held. Surviving women now in their 80s were invited. No press was invited. An official read a prepared statement that acknowledged in general terms that female military personnel had experienced conditions during German captivity that differed from those experienced by male prisoners, and that the government recognized their service and sacrifice. Mary Collins was not there. She had died in 1988, 13 years before the government acknowledged what she had lived through. She left behind journals hidden in her attic that her niece found while clearing the house. The journals were eventually donated to the National Archives, where they joined the declassified files as primary source material for researchers studying women's wartime experience. In one of the last entries written sometime in the mid-1980s, she addressed the reader directly. "Someday someone will want to know what really happened to us. I write this for that day. I do not expect to see it. Some burdens you carry your whole life, hoping the next generation will not have to." Sarah Bennett lived until 2003. She was 91 years old. In her final years after Richards' book was published and the German documents were accessible, she began speaking publicly for the first time. She gave several recorded interviews. She described what had happened with the careful precision of someone who had been holding the words in exact order for almost 60 years. In one of those interviews conducted in 2001, The interviewer asked her how she had survived the isolation period, the 6 weeks alone after Rahn implemented enhanced separation. She was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "I talked to myself. I gave myself my rank and my unit and my serial number every morning when I woke up. I was Flight Officer Sarah Bennett of the Air Transport Auxiliary. I said it out loud in my cell every single day. Because if I stopped knowing who I was, they would have won." She paused. Then she said, "They did not win." Elise died in 1999, 1 year before the German documents produced formal recognition of what had happened to women like her. She had spoken to Richards in 1987 and again in 1995 after the Berlin archive discovery. In her final recorded interview, she said something that Richards quoted in full in her book, and that has been quoted in every subsequent account of this history. It was not just what the Germans did to us. It was what our own people did after. They told us to forget. They hid our reports. They treated us like we had done something shameful by surviving. We were betrayed twice. First by our captors, then by our countries. I want that written down. I want that part remembered too. It is written down. You are reading it now, 70 years after a German captain looked at a woman in an American uniform and decided the rules of war did not apply to her. In Part 4, we look at what this history means for the legal frameworks governing the treatment of women in military service today, at how the failures documented in these files shaped subsequent expansions of the Geneva Convention's protections, and at the question that runs through all of it: what do we owe to people whose courage was real, but whose story was erased? The answer is more actionable than you might expect. And it starts with a treaty revision that almost didn't happen. But across 3 parts, we followed Mary Collins from a radio station in Italy to a secret facility near Frankfurt. We followed Sarah Bennett from a downed Spitfire to a cell outside Paris. We followed Elise from the Lyon countryside through interrogation rooms that appeared on no official map. We watched Colonel Rahn's program fail against women it was designed to destroy. We watched Allied governments classify what had happened and silence the survivors. And we watched decades later, as the truth surfaced anyway, first in Helen Richards' interviews, then in the East Berlin archive discovery of 1995, then in the quiet American ceremony of 2001 that honored women in their 80s who had waited half a century for a room with no cameras and a statement read from prepared notes. Part 3 ended with the question: what do we owe to people whose courage was real, but whose story was erased? Part 4 is the answer, and it is more complicated than a ceremony with no cameras. Mary Collins died in 1988 at the age of 69. She died in the same city where she was born, Columbus, Ohio, in a house 3 miles from the telephone exchange, where she had worked before the war and returned to work after it. She never received a medal specifically for her captivity. The Purple Heart. She was eventually awarded sighted wounds received in the line of duty in language so general it could have described a sprained ankle. Her military file, the one accessible to the public, described her service in Italy in terms of her communications work. The section covering the period from her capture in October 1943 to her liberation in April 1945 contained a single line: detained by enemy forces, returned to Allied custody. April 1945. Debriefed. Cleared for return to service. 18 months of what she endured, reduced to a single bureaucratic sentence. She worked at the telephone exchange until she retired at 62. Her colleagues remembered her as precise and self-contained, someone who always arrived exactly on time and never discussed personal matters during work hours. Her neighbors remembered a woman who kept a careful garden and who sometimes had lights on in the attic late at night, which is where she went to write in the journals her niece eventually found. She never married. She never flew a flag outside her house on Veterans Day. When the local newspaper ran a feature on area women who had served in World War II in 1976, she declined to be interviewed. She had signed a document. She kept her word to a government that had not kept its word to her. Bummed. Sarah Bennett outlived her by 15 years, dying in Bath in 2003 at 91. After Richard's book and the German archive discovery gave her something to point to beyond her own testimony, she began speaking in her final years with the directness of someone who understood she was running out of time to be heard. The recordings of her interviews from 2001 and 2002 are held at the Imperial War Museum in London. They are among the most precise first-hand accounts of female captivity in the German system that exist anywhere. She speaks without self-pity and without dramatization. She describes what happened the way a pilot describes an instrument reading accurately, completely without ornament. And in one of those recordings, she was asked what she wished had been different. She said she wished the debriefers who questioned her in 1945 had been replaced by people who understood what they were hearing. She said she understood why governments made the decisions they made, even if she did not excuse them. And then she said something that the interviewer later described as the moment she had to stop the recording to compose herself. SERE said the worst part was not what happened in Germany. The worst part was coming home and having nowhere to put it. The Germans at least knew what they were doing to us. Our own people just wanted us to disappear quietly, and we were too well trained to make noise. Elise died in Lyon in 1999 in the house where she had been born, surrounded by a family that knew she had been in the resistance and knew she had been captured and knew almost nothing beyond that. Her daughter found the recordings Richards had made in 1987 and 1995 after her death in a box in the back of a wardrobe and listened to them for the first time alone in her mother's kitchen. She described it to a French journalist in 2003 as hearing her mother's voice tell a story she had never been told in a room full of her mother's things, with the realization that the silence had been a choice her mother made every single day of her life. These three women and the hundreds like them, whose names did not make it into Richards's book or the 2001 ceremony, or any other record, constitute the human core of a story whose institutional dimensions are just as important and considerably less told. The 1949 revision of the Geneva Conventions, negotiated in the aftermath of World War II, included for the first time explicit provisions for the protection of women prisoners of war. Article 14 of the Third Geneva Convention specifically required that women be treated with all consideration due to their sex. Article 25 required that women's quarters be kept separate from men's, but be subject to the same oversight and inspection requirements. Article 29 required that women have access to sanitary facilities appropriate to their sex. These provisions are directly traceable to the experiences documented in the files that Allied governments had classified and were not sharing publicly. The delegates who negotiated the 1949 revisions worked from briefings that drew on the classified materials. They knew what the German system had done. They wrote the new provisions, knowing exactly what gap those provisions were designed to close. The irony is precise and uncomfortable. The governments that silenced the survivors used the survivors' experiences to write new rules without ever telling the survivors they had done so, without ever acknowledging publicly what had made those new rules necessary. The 1977 additional protocols to the Geneva Conventions went further, establishing that women deprived of liberty for reasons related to an armed conflict must be held in quarters separate from those of men, that they shall be under the immediate supervision of women, and that they shall not be subjected to any adverse distinction based on sex. Protocol 1. Article 76 extended specific protections to women who are pregnant or mothers of young children. These protections exist because of what happened in 15 unmarked facilities across occupied Europe between 1943 and 1945. They exist because those facilities failed to remain secret. They exist because women kept journals in cracks in walls, and because a researcher named Helen Richards asked the right questions in the 1980s, and because German archivists in East Berlin opened a sealed crate in 1995. The legal framework protecting women in military captivity today is built on a foundation of suffering that was deliberately hidden and on the refusal of the people who suffered it to let it disappear entirely. Beyond the legal legacy, the history of these women contributed to significant changes in how military organizations train personnel for captivity. SERE training, survival evasion, resistance and escape. which had existed in various forms since the Korean War, was substantially revised in the 1980s and 1990s to incorporate gender-specific preparation for what female military personnel might face in captivity. The revision drew directly on the classified files that were being slowly released during this period, as well as on Richards's published research. The training acknowledges explicitly what the German system discovered through months of failure, that women's psychological resistance in captivity operates differently from men's, not more weakly, but differently, drawing on social bonds and identity maintenance strategies that require specific recognition and support. The women Colonel Rahn could not break had already demonstrated the effectiveness of these strategies in the worst possible laboratory. The training now tries to give women the theoretical framework for what they would be doing instinctively. The question that runs through all of this, the one that Mary Collins addressed in her attic journals and Sarah Bennett addressed in her IWM recordings and Elise addressed in Richards's interviews, is what we owe to people whose service to their countries was genuine, whose suffering was documented, and whose stories were officially erased. The 2001 ceremony with no cameras was one government's answer. It was insufficient by any measure, and better than nothing by a narrow margin. Yes, the fuller answer is this: we tell the story accurately. We include the second betrayal alongside the first. We do not sanitize what the German system did by using the clinical language the German system used to describe it. We do not excuse the Allied government's decision to classify the survivors' testimony by describing it only as a wartime security measure. We say clearly that women who had endured what no military training could have prepared them for were then asked, by their own governments, to spend the rest of their lives pretending it had not happened. And we say clearly that most of them did exactly that with the same discipline and precision they had brought to everything else, and that this compliance was not weakness, but a final act of service to institutions that did not deserve it. Now the final detail, the one that most accounts of this history leave out.
SERE.
In 2019, a researcher at the U.S. National Archives named Dr. Patricia Okafor was cataloging newly transferred materials from Army intelligence records when she found a file that had been misfiled in 1946 under a logistics classification, rather than the intelligence classification that would have had it sealed for decades longer. The file contained a report prepared for the Joint Chiefs of Staff in October 1945, 6 months after liberation, summarizing findings from the debriefing of female military prisoners. The report's conclusion, written by a senior Army intelligence officer whose name remains partially redacted in the version released to researchers, reads as follows: female military personnel subjected to specialized German detention demonstrated resistance characteristics superior to those of male prisoners in comparable situations as documented in parallel debriefing records. Recommend formal study of conditioning factors contributing to this outcome for application to future POW resistance training. The recommendation was never acted on. The report was misfiled. The study was never conducted. And the women whose resistance had impressed even the Army intelligence officers debriefing them were sent home with secrecy agreements and prescriptions for sedatives. What the German system spent 2 years trying to destroy the Allied system then failed to recognize or honor for 55 years. The irony does not resolve. It sits there in the record exactly as uncomfortable as it should be. Mary Collins, Sarah Bennett. Elise and hundreds of women whose names do not appear in this account gave their governments something those governments did not know how to value. They demonstrated under conditions designed to prove the opposite, that the identity a person builds through choice and training and commitment is not something that can be taken from the outside. That what makes a soldier is not the uniform or the rank, but something located where no examination can reach it. They said their names to themselves every morning in cells where no one was listening. They were still soldiers. They were still fighting. From an Ohio telephone operator who wanted to serve her country to the legal framework that protects every woman in military captivity anywhere in the world today, the distance is measured not in treaties or training manuals, but in the journals hidden in attic walls, and the letters written in careful handwriting to women who understood what they meant. If this story stayed with you, share it. There are hundreds of histories like this one that governments filed under the wrong classification, and researchers have spent decades recovering. The comment section is the right place to name the ones you know. Subscribe to find the ones you don't. The last thing Mary Collins wrote in her journals in handwriting that had grown small and careful with age was this: "We did not break." Remember that. Whatever else is forgotten, remember that we did not break. She was right. And it took the world 70 years to say so.